forests play a huge role in the resilience of our communities. There are a lot of communities that live next to or downstream from our forests. The condition of those forests affect the air quality, the fire risk, the flood risk, the access to clean drinking water, for example. All of those things are impacted by the health and the state of the forests around us. A lot of those forests today are not in the shape that we need them to be in. And unfortunately, that's the result of active policy that we pursued as a country. So for a lot of the 20th century, our stated goal when it came to managing forests and reducing fire was fire suppression. Let's eliminate the fire that's happening in the wooded lands around us. That made a lot of sense because if you get rid of fire, potentially you get rid of fire risk. What the inadvertent consequence of that is that we ended up building forests that are much more fuel and are much more flammable than they ever were before. One of the things we didn't appreciate at the time is that fire plays a natural part of that ecosystem, of that landscape. So we needed fire to remove the kind of small diameter trees that are in a forest that can take a forest that starts on the ground and lift it into the canopy and really adds to the kind of massive fires that we're seeing in places like California last year. So we have forests, they play a critical role. So you actually have people going into the forest with machinery, removing the kind of small diameter trees and foliage that can take small fires and take them up to the canopies to create these large conflagrations. That takes work. It takes a lot of work. Right now, it takes mechanical work. Once that work is done, those forests create a tremendous amount of benefit for the communities that live near them. The issue is, how are we going to pay for it, right? Paying for all of that work to be done up front can be challenging for the local communities or all the other stakeholders who might participate in this. And right now, all too often, we don't have an answer to that question of how are we going to mobilize the resources we need to do this work. I'm Stuart Yasgur, and this is Economic Architecture, the podcast.
Wildfires keep getting bigger. The threats of climate change and how our forests have been managed for the past 100 years or so. And there are solutions to reduce that risk of wildfire and to protect all the things like communities, water resources, biodiversity, all the things we enjoy. Those solutions cost money. And they require a workforce, and they require a system that's attuned to address that challenge.
This week, I had the opportunity to speak with the co-founders of Blue Forest, Nick Wobbrock and Phil Saksa.
Nick Wobbrock, co-founder and chief conservation officer of Blue Forest.
Phil Saksa, co-founder alongside Nick and chief program officer.
What Nick and Phil have done is create a financing mechanism. They call it the Forest Resilience Bonds that says to investors, hey, investors, here's an investment opportunity. If you invest money with us upfront, we can then work with local communities to make sure that resilience efforts are carried out. They've come in and said, let's use the financial mechanisms, tools, technologies, insights that we develop for built environments and move those over to the nature-based infrastructure that we have.
When we think about financing need for these projects, is how do we deliver capital to the projects so that they can get done more quickly on the ground than they otherwise would?
Blue Forest is part of connecting that system and the capital to supercharge that system so we can achieve landscape resilient ecosystems and watersheds.
We talked about how to make our forests more resilient through an innovative financing mechanism that brings more funding into resilience building itself and ultimately enables the restoration of forests at a timeline and a scale that otherwise wouldn't be possible.
Really, Blue Forest is focused on conservation finance outcomes for our current climate crisis, for the wildfire challenge, and for other ecosystem restoration projects that, from what we see, have a lot of benefits. We put out a paper a couple of years ago that showed 11 different benefits coming from any forest restoration project that could provide value. Some of those are monetary, some of those are non-monetary. But for the monetary ones, something that we started off from as a thesis was understanding like the way we've developed and financed built infrastructure in our society has been to use a lot of financial tools to put the upfront capital in to build big systems, to build dams, to build levees, to build transportation networks. And the theory behind what we wanted to do at Blue Forest was really to take those same tools and apply them to natural infrastructure. So the forests and watersheds that feed our water supply systems, that make sure we have clean, healthy air to breathe, and make sure that we have, recreation opportunities and other things for people to get out there. So it was really meant to take that system that we've used for a long time from financing, build infrastructure, and taking that to natural infrastructure.
What are we picturing when we picture some of the solutions to help reduce the risk, for example, of wildfire?
Some of the solutions to reduce wildfire are, in part, recognizing that not all fire is bad, but we need to get the ecosystems back to a place where they can accept wildfire. And so getting it back, in part, is helping restore ecosystems to where they had been, especially before all fire had been prohibited on landscapes, even though historically, from time immemorial, many indigenous communities were applying fire to the ground. And that common cycle of fire was very healthy for thinning out the small diameter wood that can sometimes be what's called a ladder fuel, takes a ground fire up into the canopy, and also cleaning out some of the flammable underbrush. So, what's helpful now, and before natural fire can be allowed to persist or coexist, there needs to be some intervention that's often from mechanical means, thinning out some of the small diameter trees, and also paying for contributing to prescribed fire when the conditions are right. And so those are called ecological forest restoration in part. And they contribute to keeping the carbon where we want it in the big trees, but removing some of the fire prone risks that contribute to the big conflagrations and devastating, damaging fires.
My background's in forest hydrology, so I spent a lot of years understanding the impacts on forest dynamics, the climate change that we're seeing in forests, increased droughts, increased wildfires, more growth over time because of the lack of fire in these forests, and what it was really doing to our downstream water supply and our water security, particularly here in California, where we get over half of our water supply from these forested watersheds. And so as these systems change, the timing of that water, the amount of that water coming into our systems, into our reservoirs and pipes is going to change as well. And so a lot of it was trying to understand, if we create a forest that is more resilient to these shifts in climate, to these shifts in wildfire, can we create a more resilient and sustainable source water supply for agriculture, for hydropower, for drinking water systems? So it's really thinking about that as one of the primary reasons I think I got into this, was really thinking about it from that aspect. But it's all the other things that Nick mentioned as well, which is, essentially how do we like maintain a stable source of carbon on the landscape at a sustainable rate? How do we reduce emissions that affect everyone's public health when they breathe in wildfire smoke, both from communities near the fire and communities far away? So it's thinking about those outcomes that we really want to be managing for, and how do we achieve those at a scale that starts to meet the scale of these wildfires that we're experiencing.
When we're talking about forests, we're looking at impact it has on fires, the threat from fire, the impact it has on our water for agriculture, for drinking, as well as health. And then, of course, what it contributes to holding carbon so that that carbon doesn't go and contribute to further kind of climate change. So this is by looking at forests, we're bringing all of those different lenses to the same set of
Yeah,
assets.
absolutely. The beautiful aspect of a restored ecosystem or watershed or forest is that it provides so many services, like you just mentioned: clean water, clean air quality, and smoke is a big concern. Resilience for your infrastructure, habitat, biodiversity, recreation. I could keep going on. After a fire, flood risk is bigger. So you want to avoid fires if you want to reduce flooding risk often. Every watershed is different, but there's complexities in that. So that's the beautiful thing. A healthier watershed provides all of these benefits. The challenging thing is no one party either has the resources or the agency or both to be able to address that challenge. Yet many parties could all benefit when this restoration work happens, including the general public at large. So how can we fund that? How can we finance it? Why is it important? And for me, part of this was, as a civil engineer before starting Blue Forest, there's a ton of tools that local governments use to build infrastructure. Can we translate some of those tools that put millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions towards water, utility water infrastructure, and other community infrastructure? Can we translate those models to help activate and effectuate ecological infrastructure? And that gets us pretty excited. And that's often how the forest resilience bond works. The why, how it works is we can model different benefits, we can value some of those benefits, we can put numbers behind it. But then how do we come together and collaborate? Blue Forest has three sort of taglines: science, finance, and collaboration. This has to be through partnership. It's not our projects, it's the community's projects. But it also is generally aided by some acceleration of capital. That's the finance. And why do we want to do it, or how can we reach more audiences that probably value certain aspects, whether that's water or wildfire risk reduction? That's the science as well. We can merge those together to try and think of a holistic system to fund restoration at scale.
So we have to remove a lot of material from these forests, right? We have these kind of thin diameter trees that burn quickly and take fire from the ground up into the canopy. So we have to get rid of that material. Now the question is, what do we do with it? We can burn it in a way that it won't lead to forest fire, but then if you do that, you're contributing to the emissions issue. And now you're saying, well, there could be other uses for it. Can we actually set up local community sawmills to turn that wood into usable product in some constructive way?
You're 100% spot on. What is the full value chain of a tree, especially a small diameter tree that is contributing to fire risk? So you want to remove it. Historically, would not have been there. And I urge any listener that's curious to sort of, there's a great TED talk from a science advisor years ago, a science advisor to Blue Forest named Paul Hesburgh, called The Era of Megafires. I think it's the 15-minute video I have my mom watch if she wants to know, what are you trying to work on? Why is this a challenge? And it shows some of the states of how the forests have changed from fire exclusion and fire suppression combined with climate stresses. We're in a real mess. But there are some of these solutions and some of the value add opportunities. Some of it's small diameter wood utilization. I'm seeing innovation and work on how can we make biochar from some of those solutions, or how can we make alternatives to peat from slash piles, which has a double whammy. If you can avoid some of the peat mining that occurs, there's a very big system integration for forestry to integrate that into our economy in bigger and bolder ways. It's going to help achieve climate resilience, positive economic outcomes, and community resilience that are really core to what gets Blue Forest excited and why we are excited about this space.
When we think about financing need for these projects, is how do we deliver capital to the projects so that they can get done more quickly on the ground than they otherwise would? And so one of the things that you see with sources of funding for this kind of work, the common public sources of funding, is that they're often reimbursable in nature. That means you have to go out, hire a contractor, do the work, get the invoice for the work, and then submit that invoice for payment. Sometimes that payment can take a long time, depending on the agency you're dealing with and the exact system that they have internally. So sometimes it would be up to 6 months or longer before a contractor gets paid for their work. And they have to meet annual payroll or weekly payrolls. They have to meet their equipment loans. And so one of the things that capital enables us to do is to provide bridge loans for those sources of funding that already exist in the system. Again, state and federal program loans for doing this kind of work, and ensure that contractors are actually paid in 7 days, 10 days, 14 days, so that one, you're hiring more local contractors and you can build up capacity on local contractors because they're getting paid quickly and they don't need to be a large regional or national firm that has a lot of financial resources that could bridge a 6-month gap in payment. The second thing that we do is really articulate the outcomes to other funders who would care. And so when we think about those other funders, often we're thinking about water and electric utilities, folks that might be affected when a fire happens, and you have essentially sedimented water coming into your pipes. That's not something you want. Or when infrastructure burns, contamination into your water system, or to electrical power systems. So whether it means they have to shut off due to PSPS events and the weather conditions, and making sure that there's more resilience both from an ignition that starts from electrical infrastructure as well as to that infrastructure from outside ignitions. And so there's a lot of value there that we articulate to utilities on these projects and how they can improve resilience for our utility infrastructure. The last thing that we really look at is corporate sustainability goals. And so there's a lot of companies in the areas that we work, again, that are either downstream and take some of the water that is supplied by these areas, or essentially have climate goals around their carbon emissions. And these projects can meet sustainability goals around corporate climate commitments and corporate water sustainability commitments in ways that really speak to what companies are trying to achieve with sustainability and their current sustainability plans.
And so then you're helping to bring those different stakeholders who might have an interest in seeing these projects actually come together to the table in a way that they can contribute funding so that this actually moves forward more quickly than it would have otherwise.
We're providing a pathway, and we're also providing a way for them to commit funding over a number of years. So one of the things with these projects is they are very expensive. They cost a lot of money up front, but the benefits of fire resiliency or water supply resiliency last for 10 years or more. I mean, a lot of these systems before fire might return to a previous risk level after you are finished with the initial restoration. So it doesn't necessarily make sense to pay for all those benefits on year one. So something that we can do with the financial tools that we provide, the forest resilience bonds, is to say, okay, so pay for that over time, because that's what actually makes most sense, because you're achieving the benefits of water sustainability, fire resiliency over decades. And so why not pay on that time frame as well? And that also enables you to commit more funding as a utility or as a company than what you might have on an annual budget.
And so you're mentioning the forest resilience bonds. Can you just tell us a little bit about how they work and where people can, where do you float them and how does that work?
So forest resilience bonds, one bit of a surprise, they're not actually bonds, which oftentimes people will then breathe a sigh of relief. There's no credit rating, there's no issuance, there's no cost. These are very quick to put together if you have all the right ingredients in place. They're short contracts, and they're a set of contracts that let us advance capital to a project where there's additional, in some of those contracts, there's the repayment sources that'll pay back those loans. So a little more mechanically, Blue Forest, we are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we set up, gets a little jargony, but project financing vehicles for each project. Why do we want to get in the jargon? Because the investment world is familiar with a project financing vehicle. And that might sound intimidating, but that's how a wind farm, a solar field, a real estate project, those are typically project financed project by project. So they look familiar. Folks know what they're putting money into and what it's going to accomplish, and they know what the sources of repayment are going to be. Instead of, in the case of a solar field, you might have a utility making payments over time for some of that energy it generates, which pays back the loan. This case, we set up 1, 2, 3, or more contracts from water utilities, from corporate entities, and potentially advancing against grant commitments that form the source of repayment. And each project is typically around the perimeter or boundaries of a large watershed that has common beneficiaries or stakeholders downstream or proximate that might care about those outcomes. It's a concessional financing vehicle, so they're super low interest, but that's put on the project level. And then the contractors and implementation partners, they really get advances at no cost plus additional granted money to get work done. So why is that important? The parties that are often doing this work, they're tribal entities, they're small nonprofits, they're big nonprofits. They're very often the entity is coordinating this work on the ground that's maybe planned the work is a nonprofit. And they simply cannot advance the money, like Phil was saying earlier, when we're trying to accomplish millions and tens of millions of dollars of work more quickly. Historically, conservation work and resilience work has been a grant-funded world. Yet our water utilities, our school districts, our local governments, they're using different sources of financing to build important infrastructure. We won't be able to get to resilient landscapes if we are looking at small grants compared to enduring, sustainable repayment sources that can treat watersheds like the ecological infrastructure and more that they provide to communities.
So And now we're getting a sense of like why this is really important, what you're doing about it, how it's kind of starting to come together. Can you give us an example of one of the projects that you've actually worked on?
Sure. I just came from a meeting this morning with our North Yuba Forest Partnership. So, our Yuba Forest Resilience Bonds were really our first two forest resilience bonds. And what that looked like was the Yuba Water looked at Yuba Water owns and operates a almost million acre foot reservoir at the bottom of the North Yuba River watershed. The reservoir was built initially for flood protection after a series of floods in the late 1950s. But that reservoir and Yuba water provide hydropower to the system, to California's public system. They provide water to 8 agricultural irrigation districts, and they're also a flood control district. So those are three essentially functions that could be three separate functions or three separate utilities in a different watershed. And then upstream of them is 275,000 acres of a forested watershed, of which 75% are national forest land. They don't own that watershed. They don't have a say in what goes on in that watershed, but they will be highly affected by anything that happens to that watershed, particularly a large fire. The North Complex fire happened just 4 miles north of them and was the size of their entire watershed, 300,000 acres. So when they're looking at risks to their system, this is one of the risks they want to manage. And so they committed funding to improve the resilience of their source water supply. They committed to $6 million to a Yuba 2 forest resilience bond, which was leveraged with another $6 million in state funding and over $100 million in federal funding with the Bill and Ira funds that came from the wildfire crisis strategy. And so what we did is we set up a loan with the National Forest Foundation and said, go do the work as quickly as possible. We will advance you capital to given all these different funding sources, Yuba Water, state agencies, federal agencies. And when that comes in, you repay the investors and we'll make the investors whole. So that's really how the system works is we advance money to that implementation partner like National Forest Foundation. They hire the contractors, get the work done, and then as those different sources of repayment come in, we're able to repay investors. So that's really the function and the outcomes of all of this system working and working well is fire resilience for communities and that watershed and water resilience for the Yuba Water Agency.
And when did this start? Where is it in its timeline? Where you said 2 years ago, is that right?
Yeah, so the North Yuba Forest Partnership, we launched the first forest resilience bond, Yuba One FRB, in 2018. Just a year later, in 2019, 9 partners came together to form the North Yuba Forest Partnership. This is federal agencies, state agencies, large nonprofits, local nonprofits, tribes, to understand like how do we plan and implement the rest of that 275,000 acre watershed. The first project only was in a footprint of 15,000 acres of that watershed. So we were just getting, less than 10% of the way there with that first project on making this entire watershed resilient. So we're now in essentially year 7 of that partnership, year 8 since that first forest resilience bond. We launched the second forest resilience bond in 2021, the Yuba 2 forest resilience bond, which was aimed to restore the next 50,000 acres of that watershed. So that gets you to a total of 65,000 acres. So we're starting to make some progress. And the third area is just being planned for another 50,000 acres. So the partnership is planning and permitting 50,000 acres at a time, approximately. And so we're starting to make some real headway and real progress on getting that entire watershed to a more resilient state. And so the question now is starting to pivot from, well, how do we do the initial restoration to how do we maintain what we've done? Because this stuff grows back. And so how do we put prescribed fire and cultural fire on the landscape to maintain what we've put a lot of work and a lot of resources into, both as partners and then just financial resources.
Yeah, Nick, I think you mentioned it earlier, is that in place of fire, a lot of this is being done mechanically, which means you have people actually going into the forest, removing organic material that's there, this kind of latter pieces, so that it won't contribute to that kind of burn. Is that right? How big of 50,000
Yeah.
acres is massive? How many people are actually in this forest working?
think our impact report was talking about 25, 30 jobs for each project or different, depending on the size of the project and the work getting done. So certainly this is good for workforce. There's also some of our partners on the project, partners in other projects. There's a lot of innovation in this space too. Companies figuring out technologies to help make implementation of this work more cost effective and more quickly. So one company that we're big fans of, talk to regularly, is called BurnBot. They have much smaller equipment that you can remotely operate from a distance. Instead of a big Caterpillar, it's a much smaller footprint. Other companies figuring out how to put prescribed fire on the ground, even at this event called Conservation X Labs and their Fire Grand Challenge. And there's a lot of drone work around system detection, system planning, thinking about all the innovation around this wildfire tech and ecosystem. And capital is needed to make any innovation work as well. And so Blue Forest plays both a role in financing restoration projects. We also are really privileged to have something called the California Wildfire Innovation Fund, which is managing money from different impact investors. One is an insurance company, CSAA Insurance, which is in California, that looks at what are the technology solutions around wildfire tech and how can we advance and catalyze those. I think that's partly because Blue Forest has this purview in understanding what are the bottlenecks and barriers to seeing landscape scale restoration occur. And it's a real privileged position, and also a position where we have to honor those insights and say, how can we try and maximize impact, and where do resources need to go to be able to catalyze a system that has a lot of structural barriers historically and present to making landscape projects work.
And once you start to build the market forces around this ecological restoration, right, then there's all these possibilities for innovation, and kind of smart, clever innovators can start thinking about ways of solving a whole myriad of problems, right? And your kind of enabling financing to flow is critical to helping those market forces get traction. That
100%. It's probably impossible to finance any equipment that you might only be able to keep busy for 6 months or a year. But when you can see a program of work in an area that's going to be enduring for 10 years or more, then you all of a sudden know, that equipment, that workforce, that there can be more oomph and resources to support a restoration economy that can be so essential for the state of California, for the Western US, and so essential for these communities as well, where employment can sometimes be not as often available.
what so in order key to getting all this going is you've been able to bring capital to bear. Who do you see as what does the kind of investor look like, and what's their motivation? Are they looking at this as a financial opportunity for them? Is this private individuals? Are there institutional folks? What's the scale of the fund? Just if you could help us picture a little bit about who's playing that critical role here.
Yeah, when we look at the investor class that are involved in these projects, there's different types of investors and different outcomes that they're interested in. So you do have institutional investors that are interested in this. That's a lot of where Blue Forest got its start, was institutional investors saying, this sounds like a great idea. I want to invest in this. But when you talk to a lot of institutional investors managing billions of dollars, they can't invest in projects that are millions or even tens of millions of dollars. Their minimum investment threshold might be $50 million, and we're not there yet. We're working towards that kind of scale, but we're not there yet. And so you do have what we call like institutional impact investors, however, which are really folks that are interested in environmental or social outcomes from these projects, oftentimes both, because you have a workforce and a community protection aspect of these, as well as an environmental outcome that is both positive and uplifting. So you have those kind of market rate impact investors that we engage. And then you have what Nick referred to before and what we call it concessional investors. So basically, folks willing to provide lower than market rate interest to these projects, either one, because they have a mandate to, or two, because they're simply interested in enabling and being a catalyst to this kind of system, where that allows us to provide lower cost loans to the folks implementing this work and managing that work. So that means that more capital is going to the work on the ground and less to essentially like paying investors. And so there's that component as well. And so we think about different products for those different investor classes. When you think about kind of your market rate investments, we're thinking about something like the California Wildfire Investment Fund, right? So that's a typical type of investment, market rate investment vehicle. AAA Insurance, as Nick mentioned, is part of that. They manage a large amount of assets, so they are looking for those kind of larger portfolios to commit to. But they are also interested in the wildfire resilience to because they hold a large property and casualty insurance portfolio in Northern California, right? And so one of the outcomes that would be great from their perspective is if we're increasing fire resilience to the system, and I'm also, earning some interest on my investment that is helping create that system of reduced wildfire risk, then that's a win-win from, my perspective. So you have these different investor classes that are looking for different things, and so we try to tailor the products to those different types of investors. That way, we can get money on the ground as quickly as possible, as cheaply as possible when it makes sense, and when there's essentially a real business opportunity, whether from the technology side or from the wood product side, that is really going to create a return because it's the type of typical business investment that you would want to have market rate returns. That's something that we certainly want to be enable as well. And the niche that we have there that a lot of investors managing funds is we are very familiar with the Forest Service, the US Forest Service. We've had an agreement with them since 2017 to work on these projects, and we were very familiar with how they work and how they get projects planned, permitted, and implemented, which a lot of typical banks don't really understand federal agencies and how they work. And so we're very comfortable in investing in facilities that are near national forest system and often depend on projects and feedstock coming off of those lands where other investors may be less comfortable because they're just not familiar with the certainty of that, particularly when, you know, agencies can't necessarily like write you a feedstock guarantee to like your facility. So legally just not allowed to do that. So that's part of like where we fit into the system is yes, you have your kind of traditional banks that can always give you a loan at a market rate. We're looking to enable lower cost access to capital where it makes sense, and then just kind of specialized investments where we feel like we have the expertise to do that from these projects.
And we've talked a lot about California, and California's huge, but it's not the only place that has forests that play this critical role. How do you see the kind of where does this apply? What's the scope of that market? Where should this be? It's kind of
Yeah,
working
we
going
have.
forward.
Thanks for asking. We have projects, some with tribal entities in Oregon, other projects with counties in Washington State. We're actively exploring and have some great leads in Colorado as well. I think Western Montana as well. Western U.S. has a ton of wildfire challenges. We're also looking at grasslands and savanna restoration. So those are maybe less wildfire, but more around other ecosystem threats or juniper reduction, different types of ecological restoration. We definitely cut our teeth in forestry, and that's predominantly what we focus on. But there's a lot of need for ecosystem restoration, climate adaptation, and resilience for other natural nature-based solutions, nature-based systems that are providing the critical services that we all depend upon. And so bringing that science, finance, and economic collaborative lens to ecosystems in the Western US and beyond, there's a big need for that if we're going to transition our world to a more climate resilient state.
And when you look at the challenge across just the Western US, this is a $50 billion challenge. So there was about 5 billion that came down from the Bill and IRA type funding. That's a 10% down payment on what's really needed in this space to achieve resilience at scale across the entire Western US. And then you start looking at places like Portugal and Australia that are encountering the same kinds of challenges. Those are the challenge, yes, is California, it's Western US, but it's also global in the areas that have fire dependent forests all across these different continents and are looking to each other really for solutions. So that's been some of the interesting aspects of this work is that there's information exchange to say, okay, well, how do we create public private partnerships? How do we address these challenges at scale? How does capital and financial tools really fit into the system in ways that we can all get more work done and protect communities at a much faster pace?
And how do you think about the companies who might be kind of purchasing some of the bonds, or like playing the role of providing the payment on those? Is it so? You mentioned some utilities, obviously, insurance companies. It's very short, like direct line of sight. You can imagine. Are there other companies folks with supply chains, large physical presence in a region. Who else plays that role?
You have a great point. We actually haven't had insurance companies yet be payers for risk reduction. From a ton of policy barriers, there's maybe 10 insurers active in a watershed or more. Every one would love it if the other 9 participated, and they're highly regulated. So yet we've had insurers be investors with below market rate capital. So there's clearly a motivation, and whether someone's providing cheaper capital or repayment, in some ways that's a penny saved or a penny earned, right? In some ways it's the payment. So utilities make a ton of sense, both water and municipal utilities, as well as investor-owned power companies, of which we've worked with both. The additional contributing sides, we're collaborating with transportation infrastructure managers as well on wildfire risk ignition reduction, because there's a cost. Fires create a cost to transportation infrastructure. Flooding risk and debris flows create a cost to transportation infrastructure. What happens if a culvert gets plugged? There's still going to be water flowing. It's going to back up and potentially wash something out that's quite expensive to replace. And so we think about payers are thinking about their avoided costs, if there can be risk reduction activities, as well as some of those activities that may enhance a local economy. So that's we're constantly doing an economic analysis based on some science and modeling around the outcomes that could be predicted from doing this resilience type work. Additionally, there's that corporate world that's interested in carbon, clearly, water stewardship to some extent, and even growing as biodiversity and other types of outcomes. It's a little bit of a burgeoning process because the metrics, the frameworks for accounting, for tallying that, they're under development on a global scale. We bring some of those tools on how to think about it, but the demand is very voluntary from corporate entities, right? So they want to make sure that they're having credible claims that meet their goals and they're being cost effective around that. And so we're trying to provide line of sight on where those opportunities are. And I think there's not just these corporate claims that are exciting. Corporates are doing that for many reasons, some of which is they want to be able to rightfully say, here's how we're participating and contributing in positive ways too. So we want to try and make this a positive snowball that's growing with enthusiasm, because we really have to transform our world to start valuing the multiple ecosystem services that come from restored ecosystems themselves.
And when you look forward at that snowball, kind of 5, 10 years down the road, where does this go? How does this growing going forward?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things. One thing I say that I don't think my company would really like, but if we do our job, we're working ourselves out of a job, right? In the sense of like, if we have watersheds that are, resilient to fire, resilient to these shifts in climate, and have sustainable water supplies, and you're really just maintaining that over like O&M, like for any, again, build infrastructure. If we're thinking of natural infrastructure and we're just maintaining year to year, we're able to put fire on the ground, we're doing maybe a little bit of mechanical work, but there's not this huge initial restoration push cost and need. That is really what we see as success in our work. And so I think what we'll see is a few things. One is I think the carbon markets will get sorted out here in the next 5 or 10 years. You're going to have more robust standards. You're going to have things like dynamic baselines that create more confidence in those markets. And you'll continue to see companies shift either voluntarily or regulatorily towards um, wanting to be carbon neutral. I think you'll see a lot of water sustainability come up. That's, as Nick said, that's maybe less known than the carbon markets, but with all the demands of tech centers, data centers, all the like building infrastructure that is happening in our cities, and we want to see those cities continue to be successful and economically productive, and a lot of that involves growth, and a lot of that involves water demand. So how do we essentially invest in sustainable water supplies? I think you'll start to see these project sizes start to shift from, we've already seen it, from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars, from tens of acres to hundreds of acres to thousands of acres, to really thinking about those hundreds of thousands of acres kind of meeting the size of the fires that we're currently seeing, which are up to 500,000 acres in the largest fires, and starting to see, okay, we need to be working at this scale, and that we're actually going to have capacity to do that as well. And so a lot of it is going to come from capacity growth, not just the funding or financing involved in this work.
I think with some of that capacity growth and opportunity, is also utilizing, benefiting from, and supporting the traditional ecological knowledge and restoration capacity that tribal entities and indigenous communities can bring. There's both great workforce opportunities and stewardship, responsible stewardship opportunities to follow their lead in many restoration aspects. And look, we lack capacity in the system writ large. That is an area that, when empowered, would be a great leader uh, to the rest of the Western US, the rest of the US, on supporting landscapes and restoration work as well. So I think a greater role in land management, co-management of indigenous communities in watershed restoration. You know, they were the original practitioners of cultural and prescribed fire. We have a lot to learn from that, and in many ways we're trying to get back to where, when things were tended and stewarded 200 years ago, there was not the same type of conflagration and damaging fire risk that we're seeing today.
What would you say if somebody's listening to this now? They may be close to forest, they may be in communities that are close to forest, and they're hearing you talk about this. What do they do? How can they contribute to be involved to kind of take whatever role they're in to advance some of the solutions we need here?
Yeah, so there's a lot of work getting done in local communities, community wildfire protection plans, community fire safe councils, fire safe districts. Really starting there is maybe the first step towards understanding what is already going on in your community and around your community, and what are the ways that you can be more involved, more supportive, understand what you need to be doing as a homeowner or landowner or member of your community to be prepared, and then understanding really how you as an individual are critical to the success of everything else that is being done. Because if we look at it, over 95% of ignitions are human caused, right, for these fires. And so increasing education, increasing outreach, learning about this issue is really part of all of our jobs as citizens, and how we can be most effective. And whether you live in the middle of a city, as we saw with the LA fires last year, or whether you live right next to a national forest or a state forest that ultimately is at risk of fire, there are different things that you need to be doing in that situation, but we all need to be prepared, and we all need to be working in partnership towards a more resilient community and a more resilient forest at the same time.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I like that. I'd also encourage some things that people can do. Learn about the fire risk, about where you live, and learn about where your water comes from, and learn about where your water comes from. Just be more informed, because, like people sometimes when they come to Blue Forest, we're not funders. We're trying to help accelerate other people's money towards these problems and and towards these projects to resolve some of the problems. And to try and make that case for additional repayment sources and parties to contribute and participate, it requires some demand to see these outcomes of resilience achieved. And so informed individuals around what their risk is and what the risk is to their water supply, of what supports them, that's a great place to start. And then to be an advocate for wanting to see more resilience towards these public services and systems that we rely upon.
That is great. What a great kind of capstone for the conversation. I want to thank you both, Nick, Phil. This has been fantastic, really informative. For many people, it's going to also be a little bit eye-opening about the idea of taking infrastructure tools, financial tools that we've created to build buildings and built infrastructure, and bring them to kind of our natural systems that we need and rely on to create more resilient communities. So thank you both for joining.
Thanks, Stuart, for the opportunity.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
A really interesting conversation. We talked to their co-founders, did a great job of helping to explain the why and the what. So they've now created a financing mechanism that enables this work to happen more quickly than it would have otherwise, enables many other people to participate in the paying for or investing in the resilience building. They're enabling the forest restoration to go forward at a timeline and a scale that it wouldn't otherwise. They've now done this in a number of different places, including a remarkable amount of work that's been done in Yuba City, which is just north of Sacramento in California. They're doing this in parcels that are 50,000 acres at a time, so large scale, and they're doing one parcel after another. There's now interest in doing this in California, Yuba City, I mentioned, Oregon, Washington State, Colorado. One of the questions that I had for them that we didn't get to ask is, there's also a tremendous amount of forests on the East Coast. So the Carolinas, Georgia, all the way up into the Northeast. Well, the conversation really focused on forests and forest restoration. They also mentioned that there's huge potential for doing this with grasslands. And if you think about the middle of the country, there are a tremendous number of areas where there's large-scale grasslands that could potentially benefit. And we, for years, have kind of worked with and supported innovators who've done incredible work at restoring grasslands to reduce fire, improve the quality of the soil and resilience in those neighborhoods. We've also seen, interestingly, in an earlier episode, we heard Kevin Schaefer from the Milwaukee area talk about how the restoration of the forests in that area really helped with the watershed and reducing flood risks in that geography. So you can see that the innovation that they're developing, this innovative financing mechanism that's really unlocking the ability to act, is really applicable across a broad number of different geographies in the country. I'm Stuart Yasgur, and this is Economic Architecture, the podcast.